Okay, I think we're on. Well, then let me officially welcome everybody to the BioLerner study session, fall semester final exam review. Thanks all for checking in. I know it's a busy week and a busy time. I hope I can help you out in your studying for the final. Okay, I see Stephen and Larry. Okay, so go ahead and, I think we're on. Go ahead and feel free to chime in with a question. While I'm waiting for people, I'll do a general intro. Final exam coming up next week. 100 multiple choice questions. Oh, and here's my kitty coming to join me. He's been waiting for this. Pinky, say hello to everybody. Pinky wishes you well on the final. Okay. Let's see. Otherwise, I don't have a lot of specifics to tell you. You saw the proportions. I believe it was 35%, if I remember correctly. Ecology, 45%, no, 40% cell biology, and 25% genetics. Okay. Okay, starting to get a couple of questions here. So, Pranay, how does fermentation work? Well, let's see. We won't go into the vast chemical detail, but the main thing that you need to know about fermentation is that it doesn't require oxygen. The purpose of it is to get a little bit of energy out of some kind of fuel, usually glucose, and to be able to do that under conditions that are anaerobic or no oxygen. You have to be a kind of organism with the right kind of enzymes to do that. So we looked in class at yeast and how they could do alcoholic fermentation and how that was ever so useful to humans in terms of being able to make bread dough rise and make alcoholic products. And we also looked a little bit at lactic acid fermentation and the idea that your muscle cells can do that when you don't have a lot of oxygen, and that there are a number of bacteria like lactobacillus who can do that as well, and we use a lot of products that come from fermentation. So those are pretty much the main things you need to know about it. I guess one other thing would be that it doesn't produce nearly as much ATP as cellular respiration does. Okay, so it's much more efficient. You get much more fuel, much more energy, much more ATP out of the same amount of fuel, glucose, by doing cellular respiration, if you can, than by doing fermentation. But fermentation is kind of a nice backup, right? And you can do it quickly and without oxygen and generate at least kind of a slow and steady stream of ATP. You're welcome, Pranay. Thanks for joining us. Hi, Ronit. Let's see, difference between homeostasis and metabolism. First, I'll remind people again, because I think they forget about these resources, that there's really nice descriptions of a lot of these really basic concepts that are on your language guides. Okay, so I'll give a brief explanation as well, but you might want to refer to your Stability and Change Language Guide for these two terms. Okay, so they tend to be grouped together because they're both characteristics of life, meaning that living things all maintain some kind of homeostasis and they have some kind of metabolism. Okay, but they are two different things that sometimes overlap. So homeostasis is keeping any condition stable in any part of the organism, right? So far this year, we've talked about keeping things like our body temperature stable, our blood glucose stable, right? We've talked about keeping conditions within a certain part of us stable, like keeping the lysosome acidic, keeping our stomach acidic, okay? And even if those conditions in a small space are different than the surrounding areas, that's sort of the point of homeostasis, that you keep the conditions in a certain organism or even a certain part of the organism stable over time, even if the outside environment is different, okay? And often it takes energy to do that, right? Maybe it takes energy to keep your body warmer. Maybe it takes energy to pump those hydrogen ions into the lysosome so it stays acidic, right? And if it takes energy to maintain homeostasis, then that energy is going to be coming from ATP, right? And generating ATP, whether it's fermentation or cellular respiration, is part of your metabolism, right? Because metabolism is doing chemical reactions moving molecules around, moving energy around, all those kinds of processes that happen to build up molecules and break down molecules. So sometimes those are involved in maintaining homeostasis, right? In terms of the examples I gave with body heat and maintaining pH, but not always, right? I can maintain other kinds of homeostasis. For example, I might break down glycogen into glucose to keep my blood sugar up, and that doesn't require any ATP. That particular example, however, is a chemical reaction, so it's part of metabolism. So you can see there's a lot of overlap because these are such fundamental processes in the body, but they're not the same thing. Okay? Metabolism involves a lot of chemical reactions that have nothing to do with homeostasis. Okay? So we digest our food, for example. That's not really homeostasis, right? It's just something we do. So sometimes those things overlap, but they are two different things. And again, I'll refer you back to your Stability and Change language guide if you want to see that in writing. Okay? Suchita, hi. Why do populations fluctuate once they reach carrying capacity? First of all, I'm glad you're looking back at ecology. That's great. So this is actually, it's a nice follow-up question because when we think about the populations fluctuating, that is a lot like maintaining stability, right? And I'll throw in another thing, which is feedback loops, right? So there's this idea that to maintain homeostasis, it's essentially negative feedback. When something goes down, it triggers something that brings that condition back up. If the condition goes up, it triggers some response that brings it back down. Okay, so that's negative feedback. The way that populations work, even though there's not an organism controlling it, is essentially the same. There are many feedback loops that aren't in living things, right? We used a lot of examples from the economy in class or psychology. So if we're talking about populations, there are many feedback loops that happen, or I shouldn't say feedback, just feedback in general that happen. So if organisms start to reproduce, if there's any resources at all, organisms are going to start to reproduce. That's what life does, right? So the population is going to go up. And then, of course, they're going to start to use up their resources, and eventually that population will start to come back down. Okay, or maybe there'll be competition or new predators, whatever it is, those limiting factors, right? And the population is going to come back down. Okay, life will always respond to things. It's never going to stay the same. If there's any resources at all, things will reproduce. You can't help it. So the population is going to go up. And that can't continue indefinitely. So the population is going to come down, right? So even if you have a population number that seems like it's pretty well suited to the environment, it's still going to have these minor fluctuations. In nature, a lot of times those are seasonal, right? Because the resources often change with the seasons, right? But there can be many other things that would cause fluctuation. Okay, Cindy, how does the body know when to perform cellular respiration and when to do fermentation? First of all, welcome. Second, it's really about oxygen. Cells are going to get feedback about how much energy is needed, right? They're also probably realistically responding to the concentration of ATP in the cell. If it starts to drop at all, the cells are going to ramp up. You can't run out of ATP for any moment of time, right? Because cell processes will stop and cells will die. Okay, so cells are going to be very sensitive to the concentration of ATP, and if it starts to drop, they're going to ramp up whatever they can. Because cellular respiration produces so much more ATP, if there's enough oxygen, that will ramp up. Okay, but if it's a sudden increase, pretty soon the cell is going to use up all the available oxygen, right? And it's going to increase the level of fermentation, right? And then ideally, of course, more oxygen will start to be delivered. If it was for humans, it would be because we potentially would be starting to breathe faster. More oxygen would go into our bloodstream and diffuse into our cells over time, right? But there's going to be that sort of interim, in-between period of time in which there is a very low level of oxygen in the cells and a high need for ATP, right? And then you're going to ramp up fermentation if the cells can do that. Keep in mind, there's a lot of cells in our body that can't necessarily do a lot of that, right? Some cells are very limited by the fuel they can use and the processes they can do. But the reality is the cells that use the most energy in our body are our muscles and our brains, okay? So they have various options that they can do to make sure they can keep producing ATP all the time. Okay, I think I've actually caught up. That's kind of amazing. I'll pause for a moment. feel free to send further questions. Run it. How do we convert proteins to energy? Okay, I'm going to be a little picky about your language here because remember, we can't convert molecules to energy at all, right? We can break down molecules and transfer the energy that was sort of inside of them into energy molecules we can use, like ATP, right? And ultimately, we can do that with proteins. If you look at your pink language guide that had the metabolic pathways, that was the diagram. It shows you how you can send glucose through cellular respiration, you can send fatty acids through cellular respiration, and ultimately you can send amino acids through cellular respiration. Okay, now in reality this is kind of complicated because there are 20 different amino acids and they do slightly different things. But you guys don't really need to know that. Okay, for your purposes, ultimately there are ways that your cells can break down amino acids and get energy out of them. However, this is not particularly the best way for cells to get energy. It's not the best fuel, okay, for the reason that we discussed, which is that when you break down amino acids, you're left with these nitrogen byproducts that, especially in large amounts, are somewhat difficult for your body to get rid of, and if they build up, they can become toxic. So your body will, by far, preferentially break down carbohydrates and fats, and they're really only going to start to break down those proteins if they're sort of running out of options. Okay, and remember the key difference, which is that we store carbohydrates and fats, glycogen, triglycerides, right? We store a fair amount of them. We don't store a lot of protein. So if we're using protein, we are likely using protein that was part of our structure, okay? And that means we're literally breaking down parts of our structure, and people who are starving to death literally start to digest their own organs, okay? So that's not something we really want to be doing. Okay, so it's possible, but has a number of disadvantages. Okay, and ultimately it's a lot easier to store energy in fats, right? We can store a lot more of it. It's a much more energy dense molecule, and so that it's much easier to access without all the disadvantages of protein. Tricia, what is the difference between mitigation and adaptation? Okay, so mitigation are things that you can do sort of before a problem gets really bad, right? To try to keep it from being less bad in the future, okay? Let's apply that to, studying, okay? So you can mitigate the possibility, right? Sometimes it's a real thing, sometimes it's a possibility. You can mitigate the possibility of doing poorly on a test by, studying ahead of time, not procrastinating, right? Asking questions when you don't understand, all of those things, okay? But once you take the test, that part is done. You can't mitigate anymore, and you have to adapt to the results, right? So sometimes there are things you can do, like take a retake, okay? But mitigating is sort of helping future events to be better. And it's usually used in the context of mitigating against some kind of problem, mitigating to make that problem be less bad in the future, maybe to avoid it altogether, but often to make it less bad. In the context of climate change, we can't eliminate it altogether, but the more action we take now, the less bad that problem will be in the future, the less severe, okay? At the same time, there already is a problem. It's going to get progressively worse. So we are going to have to also take steps to adapt to the fact that the world is different, will continue to be different, right? So that gets us into things like building seawalls and adjusting to maybe growing different crops, things like that. Adapting to the changes that are already here rather than trying to prevent or reduce those changes in the future. Sophia's asking a practical question. Are we turning in the note card? No, you don't have to turn it in tomorrow, okay? I don't feel a need to check your note cards. You will turn it in on the day of the final, okay? So you do whatever you want. I assume people want to work on it over the weekend. You're going to bring it with you the day that you take your final. You're going to make sure your name is on it. You're going to use it during the final, and then when you turn your final exam in, you'll turn in your note card at that same time. Nathan asking about the 5 misconceptions about genetics. Okay, I don't have the PowerPoint in front of me, so I'm probably not going to remember 5 by heart, but there were definitely a number of slides in that Intro to Genetics PowerPoint that talked about common misconceptions. Okay, the ones that you mentioned: genes coding for proteins, not traits; environmental factors impact traits; multiple alleles per gene. Yeah, multiple genes per trait, I'd say. Polygenic. I can't remember what else off the top of my head, so I don't remember if I came up with that five for a particular reason. Okay, so I'd say if it's not something that we've discussed in class or on that PowerPoint, don't worry about it. I can think of one, actually, one just occurred to me that probably wasn't on that PowerPoint, but we discussed it, is this idea that recessive traits are necessarily rare and dominant traits are necessarily common. I think that's another misconception that people have. We talked about why in class, that the frequency of a trait in a population is a different thing for the most part than what makes traits dominant recessive, which is about the proteins. Ronit asking about the difference between renewable and sustainable. So renewable means literally that it can be renewed. Okay, so by renewed, what we mean is that you can get more of it. Okay, and so we'll use water. That was the context of that. Fresh water is technically renewable. New fresh water falls all the time, right? Rain and snow. That's great. So the water cycle is renewing our water for us, okay, constantly. And that, by the way, is an ecosystem service, okay? But that's not stopping, right? We're constantly getting more of that resource. Now, just because we're constantly getting more of it doesn't mean we're using it in a sustainable way. Because sustainable means we're going to be able to keep on functioning without running out, okay? But we know that if we keep using water at a faster rate than the natural water cycle renews it, that we will use it up. And we know, in fact, that we're on that path because we're already depleting our aquifers. We're using up our aquifers certainly at a faster rate than they renew, because aquifers do renew over time as well as the water sinks into the ground, right? And a little bit sinks in each year when it rains, okay? But it's a much smaller amount than what we're using. And so what we're doing instead is we're depleting these very old aquifers that formed over tens of thousands of years, and we're using them up in a few decades, okay? And they're not going to renew in a few decades. So even though water falling from the sky and water seeping into the ground and forming aquifers is renewable, it's not sustainable if we use it at a faster rate than it is currently renewing. Okay? Sometimes renewable is also applied in terms of resources that we use for energy. Okay? So things like wind and solar would be renewable because, you know, the wind will keep blowing and the sun keeps shining. But things like fossil fuels are not. Even though we find new ways to extract them, the reality is there is still a finite amount. So they're considered non-renewable. Okay? And they're certainly unsustainable. Okay. Larry's asking about the spindle apparatus. You know, that's something we no longer, certainly I no longer include in our curriculum. I can tell you briefly, it's made of protein. Hopefully that's not a surprise at this point, right? And it's a lot like the cytoskeleton. If you remember the cell video I showed on the first day of the cell biology unit, and it showed those microtubules sort of forming these big long chains, and then they were sort of coming apart. Think of the spindle like that. It's a long chain of protein, and it literally can build itself up and sort of creep across the cell and attach to the chromosomes, and it physically attaches to the chromosomes, and then it sort of makes itself shorter, right? And by doing that, literally pulls the chromosomes to the side of the cell, okay? So it literally is built just for the process of cell division and spreads across the whole cell, right? Grabs onto the chromosomes, then kind of becomes shorter and shorter, and then it's basically taken apart again when cell division is over. And your cells actually do this a lot. They build things and take them away. You wouldn't want these across the cell all the time, right? So this is just part of the process of cell division. How does carbon diffusing into the ocean affect marine life? Okay, I'm going to change your question a little bit. So when we talk about carbon diffusing into the ocean, I think you mean carbon dioxide, right? Because there's actually a lot of some different sources of carbon in the ocean, okay? When the carbon dioxide diffuses in, that carbon dioxide in the water is available to organisms in the water that are doing photosynthesis, okay? So we often just talk about plants, but actually, most photosynthesis is done in the world's oceans, right? There's a lot of ocean on Earth. So there are some plants in the ocean. Sometimes parts of the plants are right under the surface of the water, and they could actually use dissolved carbon dioxide in the water. Sometimes the tops of the plants are over the water, and they could use carbon dioxide in the air. But really, most of the photosynthesis is done by tiny photosynthetic organisms, bacteria or small eukaryotic organisms that are able to do photosynthesis in the water. As long as there's enough light shining through the sort of top layers of the water, then they can extract carbon dioxide from the liquid water because it's dissolved into the water just in the same way that carbon dioxide is dissolved into soda, right? There's a certain amount that's inside the liquid, okay? And so as carbon dioxide diffuses from the air to the ocean, that carbon dioxide is available to photosynthetic organisms to do photosynthesis. Then, of course, that builds glucose, which gets built into the parts of things, the biomolecules that make up these organisms. They grow, right? And now that carbon has been incorporated into living things, okay? Now you've got a whole food chain. Other organisms can eat those. The carbon moves through these other organisms. Those organisms are doing something like cellular respiration, where they're breaking down carbon molecules and in some cases sending carbon dioxide back out into the ocean. So you're going to have your whole little carbon cycle happening in the ocean with a little bit of interaction between the surface of the ocean and the air, where carbon dioxide is diffusing back and forth. How much diffuses back and forth depends on the relative concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere compared with the ocean. Okay, but it just basically makes its own little carbon cycle, slightly different than on land because there's more kinds of chemical reactions that can occur in the ocean, namely the one that we talked about in class, where carbon dioxide and water react to form carbonic acid, right? So that the more carbon dioxide that's diffusing into the ocean, the more acidic the ocean becomes, okay, overall. And then that, of course, is causing a lot of problems for marine life that need to maintain homeostasis and need to build shells, okay, to have to live with that increasing acidity, decreasing pH. Okay, so that's a huge threat, the problem of ocean acidification, threat to biodiversity. Okay, hi Tricia. Overshooting a population's carrying capacity. Does that mean the carrying capacity will lower? Sometimes, okay? What really determines the carrying capacity are the resources available. And there's probably other things, but that's a big one, right? So if organisms, when they overshoot their carrying capacity, you can think of that as overpopulating. If they start to overuse their own resources in an unsustainable way, okay, say for example that whatever organism it is that's overpopulating eats parts of the plants. If they eat them down all the way to the ground and eat up the roots and those plants can't grow back again, they might permanently change the carrying capacity because now not so many of those organisms could live there in the future, right? So it depends. If organisms overpopulate to the extent that they literally start destroying their own environment, which, yes, that happens, right? Then those populations are likely to crash and maybe not be able to recover because it could be that those resources, for a variety of reasons, won't be able to come back to the same level. Or maybe they'll come back, but not as much. Okay? So sometimes that's the case. Now, not always. Sometimes what happens is an organism overpopulates and they just kind of mostly die, right? And then maybe the next year, this is true with a lot of seasonal things, they have this big population surge, like in the springtime, right? Then the resources run out, they crash and they die, but the next spring it sort of starts all over again. They haven't permanently changed their environment, it's just sort of a temporary thing. And so as the resources renew themselves, the populations can climb again, right? So whether it's permanent or not depends on kind of how, whether or not the resources themselves, the resource base, what creates those resources got destroyed, okay? And that's that business of like sort of minor change versus more extreme change. Can a chromosome replicate more than once in mitosis? I mean, I guess first of all, remember that the chromosomes don't technically replicate in mitosis. They replicate during interphase. So once you do DNA synthesis, you've got two chromatids, right? I don't know that there's going to be an issue with like suddenly having like more chromatids. I mean, there are organisms that work in such a way that they do end up with more copies, but it's not something that really happens by accident. That's not something I'm aware of. That's a problem, okay? So again, chromosomes replicate before mitosis during interphase, DNA synthesis, and typically, I think that's kind of how it is, just once. Hi, Cindy. How does gray water recycling work? So gray water is a reference to that water in the household that is not too dirty, okay? So it's not fresh water coming out of your tap, but it's not water in your toilet that's, extremely contaminated to the point of being unhealthy, and that we actually sometimes call black water. So we're talking water from your shower, like after you've used it, water in the sink, water in your dishwasher, your laundry machine. They have some dirt, some soap, but they're not contaminated with human waste, sewage that's going to be a health hazard. Okay? So that kind of water, that gray water, can potentially be used again. Okay? And this is usually done on a small scale in people's homes. It could be as simple as putting a bucket in your shower and collecting the water before while you're waiting for the water to get hot or whatever, and using that bucket to water your plants, right? That's gray water recycling. Some people do have a more complex system in their house where they have, for example, pipes that carry that's used water from their washing machine and put it in a big container, again, often to water plants or something like that. You could potentially pipe water from your sink or your shower to your toilet tank, right? So there'd be ways to reuse water that aren't going to be a health problem for us. Obviously, we don't want to drink that water, right? But most of the water we use in the house really isn't for drinking. A lot of it is for watering plants, for cleaning things, etc. So a lot of times we can sort of have gently used water, right, and reuse it again for some purpose. And that's called gray water recycling. And that is a way that we can make our water supplies more sustainable, right, by reusing it a couple of times. Okay, and that way we're sort of getting more out of the water we have and still being able to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. Okay. Okay, oh, you're very welcome, Cindy. Okay, I'm all caught up again here. I think I lost some viewers with my technical problems. That's okay. Give a quick study tip. I haven't mentioned this in class, but don't forget to go back and look at your previous errors, right, that you made on things like checkups, or if you made notes from your previous test. Those are going to be things that you want to either reinforce or perhaps put on your study card, right? Prasanth, so actually I just answered that question about mitigation and adaptation a little bit ago, so you might want to flip back on the video. If I want to give you a 15-second version, it's the idea of mitigation being more like prevention against a problem happening, or perhaps being as severe as it might be if you didn't do anything. So that would be, let's say us trying to reduce the use of fossil fuels so that there is a not as high of a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as there will be if we do nothing, okay, or do very little as we've been doing. That would be mitigation. Adaptation would be taking steps to deal with the fact that the atmosphere is warmer and that seasons are changing, right? And that the sea levels are rising, and that sort of thing that's already happening. Hi, Michael. Nice to see you. I hope you guys are feeling a little more relaxed now that your homework load has gone down, right? And focus all your energy on studying. Okay, question about the difference between embryonic stem cells and adult stem cells. So embryonic stem cells are the early ones, right? Literally about a week after the egg is fertilized. And that fertilized egg just kind of grows into a cluster of cells. And that cluster of cells is what we call unspecialized, okay? Meaning that some of that cluster will eventually turn into skin or bones or nerve cells or whatever that is. And each one individually is capable of becoming anything in terms of nerve cells or bone cells or skin cells, okay? Now remember, all of the embryonic stem cells have a full set of 46 chromosomes. They actually all have the instructions to be anything, okay? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next semester, but I'll sort of preview it now. If we have the analogy to the cookbook, right? All cells have a complete cookbook. Okay, they could make cookies or soup or pasta or whatever that is, right? Um, what happens though is during the process of differentiation, in these early days of pregnancy, genes are activated in some cells. Perhaps they get signaled to be on the outside and they're going to be skin. So the genes having to do with development into a specialized skin cell, they start turning on and doing their thing, and they make all the proteins that are needed to be a skin cell. Okay, and what happens is the other instructions get permanently turned off. Okay, they never can be used again. So once a cell is a skin cell, it can only ever use the instructions for being a skin cell. Even though it technically has the instructions for being a brain cell, it can't ever use them again. Okay? It's like saying you start with the full cookbook, but once you decide you're going to be a baker, you never get to use the recipes for soup again. Okay? That's just how it works. Now, what happens is that the majority of the cells in the body become completely specialized, and they will only ever be essentially one type of cell. Okay? But there are a few cells scattered throughout the body that maintain some ability to make different cells. And the example that we usually start with is the idea of these stem cells that are in our bone marrow. Okay? They are mostly specialized. It's like the dessert section of the cookbook. Maybe they can make cookies and cake, but they still can't make soup. Okay? So the cells in our bone marrow are able to make about 6 or 7 types of blood cells. Okay? And they do that throughout our lives. It's because we have to generate a lot of blood cells in our lives. So having some adult stem cells that are capable of making a few things allows us to generate a lot of cells in certain parts of our body. Not all parts of our body have them. Okay, so for example, our heart does not. We can't easily generate, in fact, we can't generate new heart cells. Okay, because we don't have adult stem cells there. So the adult stem cells are sort of partially specialized, right, to where they can become only a few things, but at least more than one, right? Whereas the embryonic stem cells, before they start to specialize, depending just on where they are in this cluster, they really could be anything at that point. And so sometimes they are used in biotechnology therapeutically because we might actually take them out of the embryo and try to turn them into things because we know they still have that potential. Okay, very quick break because Penny came over to sit with me. So I wanted to just have her say hello. Hello from Penny. Put her back on my lap where she likes to be. Okay. Run it. How does your water footprint affect your carbon footprint? So the idea is that there's a ton of overlap between water and I'm going to say energy. Okay, so remember that a lot of our carbon footprint, what we mean by that is, our activities that generate carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or potentially methane. A lot of the energy we use is related to having all that nice water come out of our tap, right? Because we've got to pump water around, we got to clean it, okay? There's all kinds of things we have to do to have that nice water supply, okay? So as we use water, we're using the energy it took to make that water come to our house, okay? So the more water I use, the more energy is used to produce that water supply for me. So if I use less water, I'm saving a little bit of energy that it took to create that water, okay? Just like if I eat certain kinds of foods that require less energy to produce or use less products. Okay, so by using less resources in general, whether it's water or food or products, we can decrease the amount of energy that is used. And the reality is, right now, most energy, if we think of energy in terms of like electricity or heat, okay, is produced from burning fossil fuels. So as long as that's still the case, which it's going to be for some, a period of time, then by anything we can do to use less energy, ultimately uses less fossil fuels, right? And then that's going to contribute less carbon to the atmosphere, okay? And it works the other way around as well, because by using less energy, we actually save a little bit of water, because it turns out that producing electricity ends up using a lot of water. We have to cool these power plants and clean things, and there's a lot of processes that have to do with even refining oil and stuff like that that end up using a lot of water. So knowing that our water supplies are scarce, by using a little bit less energy, we actually ultimately do save a little bit of water. Even by eating certain kinds of foods, we save a little bit of water. Okay? The really good thing about all this is the same kind of activities end up saving both water and energy, right? By using less resources, requiring less transportation, all this sort of thing, we end up saving water and energy and decreasing our carbon footprint, putting out less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Nathan, key differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Yeah, I mean, I would say the main things we've focused on is really the idea of organelles, okay? The idea that, you can connect this in with endosymbiotic theory, right? This idea that eukaryotic cells contain these membrane-bound organelles. Particularly, we think of things like the mitochondria and the chloroplast that used to be little prokaryotic cells, right? So there's this significant, structural difference, okay? Functionally, they don't have to be that much different, right? In the sense that both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells do a lot of the same life functions, right? They have DNA, they make proteins, they move molecules around, they break molecules down and produce ATP. That basic functional stuff is similar, right? But eukaryotic cells have the ability to be much more specialized in how they respond to things, because not only they have specialized compartments in them, but many kinds of eukaryotic organisms are also multicellular, not all of them, but many of them, and they can even specialize parts of the organism, right? So it just allows for a lot more different kinds of life than you would have just with prokaryotic organisms. Now, that being said, I want to be really clear that there is still more variety, more biodiversity in prokaryotic organisms than all eukaryotic organisms put together. There is almost an unimaginable amount of diversity in bacteria and archaea organisms. That's hard for us to really conceive of, but there's more kinds of genes, more kinds of species of bacteria than anything else on this planet, because it was simply here for a lot longer, right? It had, millions and millions more years to evolve and develop diversity than the eukaryotic organisms have, right? So most of the really important stuff, like evolving photosynthesis, sexual reproduction, cellular respiration, all of that happened in prokaryotic organisms long before there was eukaryotic organisms. Okay, and we'll talk about that a bit more during evolution. Does DNA determine gene expression in cells? Prasant, that's kind of a complicated question. We're going to go into the gene expression in much more detail second semester. Gene expression means which DNA is used. In a way it does, because your DNA has genes that help to regulate the expression of other genes. Sort of like what I talked about with the SRY gene. Okay? So ultimately, I was about to say all the instructions are in your DNA, but that's actually not true. There's other molecules that attach to your DNA that help to regulate it as well. So that's a bit of a complicated question, okay? But no gene expression is when genes are actually used to make RNA or protein, okay? And much of that is determined by the DNA itself, okay? But also what determines a lot of gene expression, and we're going to spend some time on this later, is really the environment, right? If you think about the idea, for example, we're just going to take a really simple example. If you were going to express insulin, okay? You don't make insulin all the time. You only make it when your blood glucose is high. What determines that? Well, if you just ate a bunch of carbohydrates, right? So the DNA isn't really determining that. The environment is. So life is really this interaction between the environment and our DNA, okay? So what makes gene expression happen is signals from the environment that trigger your DNA to sometimes regulate itself, sometimes to immediately make these products, right? And there's kind of this back and forth dynamic process that's going on all the time to allow living things to respond to the environment using the information, the instructions in your DNA. Okay, Stephen's asking about the difference between differentiated stem cells and specialized stem cells. Honestly, we don't say differentiated stem cells very much. First of all, I'm not sure I would use those terms with stem cells at all. Stem cell, the term stem cell implies that it's not specialized. Now, some stem cells are more specialized than others, right? So this idea that adult stem cells are partially specialized, and there's fancy words for this. I'll say them in case anybody's run across them, pluripotent and multipotent. We don't use those words in class anymore. But the idea is that by definition, stem cells are at least somewhat unspecialized, okay? The term differentiation is really used more for the process that stem cells undergo to become specialized cells instead of stem cells, right? So if I start out with a bunch of stem cells and they go through this mostly irreversible process to become specialized cells, that process is called differentiation, okay? Now, it sort of makes sense to then call those cells differentiated, but in that way, differentiated means specialized. I think it's a little clearer if we use the word differentiate for the process, because it's much more common to refer to the finished product, like our skin cells, as simply specialized cells. Okay, stem cells by definition are not particularly specialized. I would say maybe except in the case of adult stem cells, they're sort of partially specialized, perhaps even mostly specialized, right? But we still would probably not use that as a term. She's just asking about the greenhouse gas effect. Okay, so first of all, we would say greenhouse effect. Okay, and greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that cause the greenhouse effect. Okay, so not every molecule in the atmosphere causes the greenhouse effect. Okay, the greenhouse effect occurs when incoming light energy, okay, basically flows through a lot of the molecules in the atmosphere. So let's just say carbon dioxide, just to kind of keep it simple. So there are molecules of carbon dioxide that we cannot see in the atmosphere, okay? Light mostly passes through there, okay? And we sort of know this because we can see the light through it, right? So the light's all passing through, okay? And a lot of that light energy hits the Earth. When it hits the Earth, some of it is absorbed by the molecules in the Earth, and as it bounces out, some of it bounces out as light. That's what allows us to see things, right? But some of it bounces off as a slightly different wavelength of energy, because light is really a wavelength of energy, okay? So some of it bounces off the Earth as a slightly different wavelength of energy, called infrared radiation, okay? That is essentially heat. And that is what warms the atmosphere around us, okay? The reason it's not frozen cold on Earth is because light coming in hits the ground, a lot of heat bounces out, and then that that heat does not just all rush off into space, okay? Some planets have no atmosphere, have no molecules in the air, and that heat that bounces off the planet just goes right back out into space rapidly, and it's just like a frozen ice ball, okay? But on Earth, we have just enough molecules in the atmosphere that as this heat goes up, it hits the molecules like a pinball machine. Only in this case, instead of passing right through, the energy sort of goes into the molecules briefly, so it kind of hits a molecule of carbon dioxide. It briefly kind of energizes that molecule, and then the carbon dioxide re-emits that energy back out, okay? And it re-emits it out in all directions. So rather than heat all flowing back up into space, as it hits these molecules, again, I sort of have this image in my mind of a pinball game. A lot of them are going to bounce back, right? And because a lot of this heat energy is bouncing back, the atmosphere around us stays relatively warm, okay? Now, as the atmosphere gets more and more concentrated, thicker, right, more and more heat would bounce back to the extent that like most of it is bouncing back, and it would start to get really hot. So Venus, for example, has a much thicker atmosphere, many more molecules in the atmosphere, a higher concentration of molecules, much more heat bounces in, and it's like 400 degrees or something, okay? So we happen to be at a really lovely temperature for life because there's just enough of a concentration of molecules in the atmosphere to keep it at a temperature that keeps our molecules stable, right, that life likes. So the greenhouse effect is totally natural. It's what allows there to be life on Earth. However, as we gradually, and actually quite slightly, but just a little bit, raise the concentration of molecules like carbon dioxide and methane that have this greenhouse effect, we are increasing the temperature ever so slightly, right? And in numbers, it doesn't sound like much, right? A degree or two, but that's enough to increase the average temperature on Earth by a fair amount over time. And that even small change in temperature happens to cause a lot of dramatic changes in climate, in the way that water evaporates, in the way that currents move, all kinds of things that affect life on this planet and the conditions on this planet. Okay, so the greenhouse effect is natural, but humans are increasing the greenhouse effect by increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Hi, Gabby. So is the greenhouse effect enhanced when the sunlight gets absorbed by the greenhouse gases? Okay, so I'll clarify, it's not the sunlight that's getting absorbed, it's the heat bouncing off of Earth, okay? Light and heat are not quite the same. They are both energy. They are both sort of wavelengths of energy, but they're slightly different. I know that could be a little confusing. But it's an important distinction because the amount of, if you want to think of it this way, the amount of light coming from the sun isn't really changing, right? That's not the problem. We essentially have the same amount of light coming from the sun now as we did 100 years ago. The problem is we have more molecules in the atmosphere now than we did 100 years ago. So as that light comes in, even if it's the same amount of light, about the same amount of light bouncing off the Earth, right? As heat, more of that heat is bouncing back into the Earth from these molecules. Is being, I don't like the word trapped because it's not really trapped. It goes in and out all the time, okay? But more of it at any given time is bouncing towards Earth rather than out to space, more heat, okay? So again, to clarify your question, the sunlight is not getting absorbed, the heat is. Sunlight in, heat out, heat bouncing against the molecules, back into our sort of immediate atmosphere around the Earth, causing our atmosphere to warm up. Okay, and that warms up also the oceans as well. Okay, my hands are all waving around. I hope that's helpful. Okay, I'm going to go for a little while longer, so if you have any other questions, go ahead and pipe in. I'll also put in a plug because Mr. Jones is starting his live stream right about now. So, you know, if I end up going offline at some point and you want to keep going, just log on to him. And of course, we've got some other ones coming up Friday and Saturday. Okay, but I'll stay on for a few more minutes since I got a late start tonight. Okay, Prasant is asking how do cells use active transport to maintain homeostasis. So towards the beginning of this live stream, we talked about the difference between, I guess I talked about the difference between metabolism and homeostasis, right? And one of the examples was this idea of maintaining pH, okay? So if I want to maintain pH, a stable level of pH, even if it's very acidic, I'm still maintaining a stable level in my lysosomes. The only way I'm going to do that is to keep actively pumping hydrogen ions in, right? Because it's against the concentration gradient. It's not the sort of natural direction they would flow. So I'm going to be pumping those hydrogen ions in, keeping my lysosome nice and acidic, okay, which I want it to be so that those powerful enzymes will only work in there, okay? So that would be a way that I would maintain homeostasis, okay? You could also use active transport to maintain homeostasis in terms of osmotic balance, right? So if I want to make sure that my cells are about the same osmotic concentration as my blood, for example, if say that the blood was slightly more watery and water was starting to enter my cells, okay, the blood was more dilute for whatever reason, maybe I just drank a bunch of water and it's going into my bloodstream, water would start to enter my cells. Well, your cells don't really want that, right? Because if too much water enters, it could burst the cell. So what the cells might do is start pumping solutes out, right? Remember, water follows solutes, and that would allow some of that water to flow out of the cell, right? Because you can't really push the water, you have to let it flow with the concentration gradient. So by pumping solutes out, you sort of create this concentration gradient that allows the water to flow out and therefore maintain osmotic balance. Okay, so those would be a couple examples that we've talked about. She's just asking about R selection and K selection. So those have to do with different strategies. Okay, so there's this idea of different reproductive strategies. And what we mean by that is that there are some organisms that their strategy is to have a lot of babies, even if hardly any of the babies survive, even if, you know, hardly any of those babies make babies of their own. That's just the way they function. So if you think of things like a lot of insects, for example, they will literally have like thousands of babies. Most of them don't live, okay? But by making thousands of them, or even plants that make thousands of seeds, right? Some of them will survive, okay? Sometimes species kind of go the opposite direction. They only make a very precious few babies, but they take care of them a lot and sort of nurture them, and they try to keep those precious few babies alive. So by spending a lot more energy taking care of them, a lot more time taking care of them, they have a much higher survival rate. So those two strategies might both be effective at having some offspring that do survive, right? They're just different strategies. Okay, it's a little bit like the egg and sperm. Okay, it's kind of like quality, quantity, right? Do I have a lot, even if many of them may not survive, or do I just have a few and put a lot of energy into keeping them alive, which is, of course, the strategy that humans use. Stephen, can you post the other live stream times on School Loop or through email? Okay, that's a little bit challenging for me right at this moment because they're written on the board. Actually, I think I have them in an email. I will try to do that. Okay, I think I actually have an email from the other teachers, so I will either send out an email or post it on School Loop. Okay, good suggestion. Let me write that down right now before I forget. I can tell you though off the top of my head, again, Mr. Jones is doing it right now. I want to say somebody's doing like Friday evening, and somebody's doing Saturday morning at 10. I think it's Mr. Ajarian. Live stream. Okay, but I will try to get that information out to you in some way. Oh, Nathan, you're ahead of the game. Thank you so much. Appreciate your helping there. That saves me a step. Okay, but I'll try to post it as well. So it looks like we have Mr. Jones right now, Miss Chow, that was who it was, Friday at 7, and Mr. Hajarian Saturday morning. And then the one that's Mr. Gann after school, that's like in person, old school in the classroom. So if you prefer that kind of setting, feel free to join in on one of his sessions. And he's doing a few because he was hoping the classroom wouldn't get quite so crowded as it can get. Okay, good question. Okay, I'm going to take this brief pause to remind people. I'll do this again in class tomorrow, but it's so, so important, okay? Take care of yourself over these next few days and into finals, right? Busy, hectic, slightly stressful time, right? So you're going to work on getting plenty of sleep, eating good food, relaxing a little bit, de-stressing, right? Take good care of yourself so that you can apply your full mental and physical power to these final exams, okay? But you can only do that if you've got the energy to do that, okay? So I encourage you to take good care of yourself and take a little downtime. Okay, Nathan, where are germ cells, gametes located? So they are, and I'll focus on humans here because it can vary with species, obviously, but in humans that we focused on, the germ cells are literally inside of the testes in male and the ovaries in females. Okay, so those organs contain the cells that will undergo this division. Okay, and as we mentioned, it's not exactly the same. In males, it's the quantity approach, right? So there's actually sort of stem cells that keep constantly producing germ cells because males make millions and millions of sperm, right? The sperm actually do move out of the testes at some point and they travel into some other passageways where they continue to develop, and we'll learn about that when we study physiology and the reproductive system. Females, there's a lot fewer eggs to begin with. They do mostly stay in the ovaries until they leave the ovaries in a process called ovulation and start to make their way through the reproductive system. Okay, so there are some differences between males and females. Let's see, Gabby, I'm not sure I understand your question. It says gametes and the reproductive system. I'm not sure if you were trying to reproductive organs. Okay. So I think you were responding to the previous question. Yeah. So testes and ovaries primarily. And then, of course, remember that the gametes are the sperm and the eggs themselves versus the germ cells. But meiosis is happening inside of these organs, so they're basically inside of there. What's the difference between mitosis and cytokinesis? Okay, so mitosis, and you might want to look at a picture of this, but mitosis literally physically means the division of the nucleus. And mostly that consists of the chromosomes, but the nucleus itself does have to divide. Now, meanwhile, around the nucleus is the whole rest of the cell, and it has to divide. We didn't talk about that a lot, but that means that the mitochondria individually divide. The cell builds new cytoskeleton, right? All the parts of the cell are growing. Much of that happens during interphase. And then when it's actually underway, when cell division is underway, because mitosis takes longer than the outside of the cell dividing, mitosis kind of goes on for a while, right? The chromosomes are separating and doing their whole mitosis thing, okay? And for that to happen, the actual nuclear membrane disappears. It gets taken apart so that that spindle can grow across, grabs the chromosomes, start pulling them across, right? And then as the chromosomes, this is telophase, gather in these opposite ends of the cell literally starts to rebuild the nuclear membrane around them, okay? And then at that time, it's time for the whole cell to divide, because now you actually have two separate nuclei, okay? So as those two separate nuclei are forming, the cell membrane itself, and this is an animal cell, starts pinching in like this, right? Because now I have two separate nuclei. And so now the cell can actually start to split itself in two, and that's the part that's called cytokinesis, right? But each cell now has its own nucleus, okay? So mitosis is the creation of another set of, I'm sorry, it should be really the division of the nucleus and the chromosomes into two separate nuclei, each with their own set of chromosomes. Cytokinesis is the actual division of the cell around those two nuclei. Question about the pyramids for biomass, number, and energy. Yeah, I touched on this kind of briefly. The concept is important. It just sort of ties into how ecosystems work and really kind of how life works, right? And it's this idea, this sort of fundamental idea of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, right? That no matter how hard we try, we cannot hold on to energy, that it is always going away, okay, from everything, but especially from life. So that if I have the plants at the bottom of the pyramid, right, I have a lot of plants, they're getting energy from the sun. Only a fraction of the sun's energy is actually captured in photosynthesis and becomes part of the plants. We call that biomass, when it literally becomes part of the structure, like it got built into glucose and cellulose and became a part of the plant. Okay? Only a very small amount of the sun's energy does that. Okay? Then, as the next trophic level, the herbivores are eating the plants, they don't get all the energy that was in the plants either, right? Because as they're eating the plants, there's waste going out. There's the fact that when they break down the molecules of the plants, that a whole bunch of energy goes out as heat, right? So ultimately, a very small amount of the plant's energy and mass ends up in the herbivores. So like literally, if we took all the plants on Earth and measured all the energy and mass, that would be like this much, right? If we took all the herbivores on Earth and measured all their energy and mass, it would be a lot less. Where did it go? Well, the energy went out as heat. The mass, molecules, went out as carbon dioxide, right? Because every time we break down molecules to get some of the energy, not only do we lose energy as heat, we put out carbon as carbon dioxide, okay? So as I move up the pyramid, I have ever smaller amounts of energy and carbon, okay? And why is that important? It means I can support a smaller amount of organisms, okay? So if I can support this much plants, I can only support this much herbivores. I can only support this many carnivores, right? So as I go up the food chain, it takes a whole lot of resources to support a smaller and smaller number, because so much of the energy in the carbon is already gone, already went away as heat and carbon dioxide. So just to support a small number of organisms at the top of the food chain, think lions, right? Wolves, and humans to some extent, we need a whole lot of herbivores and plants, because so much resources are going to go away in this transition between trophic levels, from plants to herbivores to secondary consumers, etc. Okay, and that's why that's such an important concept. It helps us to understand why we see different numbers of different species on Earth, for example, right? Why it is that we have to be careful in the way that we use our resources. Logistic question from Ria. Do we have to bring food for tomorrow? You don't have to. I did offer to two of my periods, particularly second and third. They were interested in bringing some food to celebrate Mr. Peneff's last regular day. If people in other periods would like to do that as well, they're certainly welcome to, although I don't know what periods that he will be attending, but you're certainly welcome to do that. Nathan, how does matter cycle in ecosystems? The easiest way to think about it is the carbon cycle, right? Carbon can cycle from the plant, as I just talked about. It can go into an herbivore, right? It can actually go into the air for a while, right? If you breathe it out, it could be taken back in by a plant. It could then diffuse into the ocean, right, and go into some aquatic organism. So that's what we mean by cycles. That atom of carbon never goes away. It takes on different forms, right? And it goes in and out of living things and into biotic and abiotic things, but it's never leaving Earth. It's not going out into space, okay? Whereas energy is essentially coming in from space, from the sun, and going back out into space, okay? So it, of course, ultimately never goes away either, but for purposes of Earth, it comes into the Earth and goes out of the Earth, right? So energy flows, matter cycles. The practical part of that means that we constantly need a new inflow of energy because it's constantly going away. We have to be thoughtful about how our matter cycles, because if it all goes one place in the cycle and we can't get it back, we're in trouble, right? So remember that we need decomposers, because gradually carbon could accumulate in organic matter if we didn't have decomposers to break down that organic matter and release it in their own carbon dioxide, okay? Yeah, and thank you, Larry. He's pointing out that mass can be converted into energy, but it's very difficult, right? And that's very true. Okay, that happens in places like the sun. Okay, on Earth, it's not. It's something that we can potentially make happen, like in a laboratory. But for purposes of life functioning on Earth, we really don't have that capability. So just to sort of keep things even somewhat simple in biology, I sort of ignore the fact that Larry's right, that there is actually a conversion of mass and energy that occurs. But for purpose of sort of biological phenomena, it's easier to think about them as being two separate things, okay? But ultimately, when you take physics, you'll see it's not quite that simple. Ria's asking, why don't alleles that code for ABO blood groups show both incomplete and complete dominance? Okay, that's an interesting question. So remember that we used the ABO blood group to show an example of codominance, okay? And remember that codominance is when the effects, or really the proteins that are produced from two separate alleles, are somehow both part of the phenotype in a way that is separate and, kind of identifiable in some way, right? So the fact that there's an A allele, which produces an A antigen, and at the same time, a B allele that's responsible for producing the B antigen, and the A and B antigen are both there at the same time, neither one is covering up the other, your phenotype is AB, right? That is a classic example of codominance, okay? There is no incomplete dominance because that would imply that somehow A and B blended together. Well, there's no such thing as that for antigens. They're literally different molecules on different parts of the cell membrane. Okay, so because of the way the protein works, because of its function, there's no way for it to blend in the way that some proteins can blend. There's no way for the phenotype to be in the middle. Okay, sometimes if a protein does a particular job, maybe if you have one allele that codes for the protein doing a lot of that, and one protein that codes for doing little of that job, you get a result that's somewhere in the middle. Okay, you're sort of partially doing that function. Okay, and that would be incomplete dominance. But that just doesn't apply to ABO. You do have complete dominance, because complete dominance means having just one copy completely covers up the effect of having a sort of non-functional copy, right, or just completely covers up the other allele. So having a B, for example, producing the B antigen, completely covers up any O-ness, right? Once you have one B allele or one A allele, you no longer have O-type blood at all. It just becomes completely B or A, right? So we would say that there's complete dominance between B and O or A and O, and in that case, O is recessive to both A and B because it's completely covered up by the presence of one of those alleles. And it's because the O doesn't actually really code for anything, right? It's non-functional. So when you have something non-functional, it pretty much can be covered up by anything, right? So a lot of things that are recessive do not produce a functional protein, and that's why they're recessive. Shruti, will this live stream be posted for us to watch later? They always are. So these live streams are recorded automatically on YouTube. So they'll always be on my BioLerner channel. You can literally watch ones from last year. Okay, that's what's kind of neat about this format. Now, of course, they can be sort of long, right? And I don't know that there's an easy way to search. I think now YouTube is allowing the chat to show. I'm not sure. But, they are available always. So, if there's a certain assessment where maybe I either don't do a live stream or maybe your question doesn't get answered in the live stream, you could certainly flip back to previous live streams and see. Now, I haven't actually gone through a whole year of doing live streams yet, but I do have some you'll see for second semester that I already did last year. You can certainly welcome to check those out. Okay, and then I'll remind you as well that the live streams for the other teachers are also recorded. So you could even go back and watch some of those, or for finals, you could even go back and watch earlier live streams that were relevant to those earlier units and see if that's helpful to you. It's totally up to you what you think would be helpful for your studying. Okay, I didn't happen to do live streams for cell biology this year because I was out of town and it didn't work out. But I think some of the other teachers did, so you could probably find those live streams on their YouTube channels. Ria's asking, what is necrosis? Okay, so necrosis, the word necro means like dead or dying. Okay, so we would say tissue is necrotic when it's dying. So necrosis is when cells are essentially dying, and it doesn't imply, as apoptosis does, that the cell killed itself. Okay, it's dying because something happened to it. So maybe it was physically damaged, maybe it got infected, maybe there was some kind of toxic chemical or something, right? And it literally has physically damaged the cell to the point where it's damaged or dying. Okay, and a lot of times for a cell, death means that the cell membrane fell apart and then the whole cell just dies. Okay, so that's what we mean by necrosis. Okay, and I'll go ahead and compare that with apoptosis. Okay, which is where the cell intentionally kills itself. Right? And it's doing it because you're a multicellular organism and it's better to sacrifice a single cell that might cause problems for the other cells, right? So this happens when cells are infected, when they are having genetic problems and they don't work anymore, maybe they're having trouble dividing, maybe they're dividing too much and they've become cancerous, right? So there's a variety of reasons that it would be better for you as an organism if those cells just self-destructed. So you do have mechanisms in your cells that can detect certain kinds of problems and self-destruct. Okay? Now, that is controlled by genes as well. You have genes that are the ones that can respond and start this process of apoptosis. So if those genes become damaged, then the cell can't kill itself when it should, right? And this is particularly an issue with cancer, that some genes that we say contribute to cancer, it's because they are responsible for making apoptosis happen when it should. And so if those genes get a mutation, the cell might lose its own ability to self-destruct. Okay? If those cells are still intact, the cell's not truly cancerous, even if it has other mutations that are a problem, because it would likely just kill itself before it started to grow out of control. So for a cell to become cancerous, it's going to have mutations that cause it to grow out of control, and it's going to have mutations in the genes that would normally allow that cell to self-destruct and go through apoptosis. So you have to have mutations on both sides, typically for cells to become cancerous. The average cancer cell has at least 10 mutations. Okay, so it's a lot of mutations that happen usually over a longer period of time. Okay, Adam's asking, hi Adam, how electricity can be produced from non-renewable energy sources. Okay, so the most common non-renewable energy source is fossil fuels, right? So if we talk about the production of electricity, there's a number of ways it can happen, but with fossil fuels, they're usually burned, okay? So they're burned in a power plant. That produces a lot of heat. That heat can be used to do things like boil water, or in the case of electricity, to turn a turbine that produces electric power. Okay, there's actually a nice website that explains that, because when it gets into the technical aspects of how these turbines work, I'm not a great source for that. But if you look back at our ecology stuff in the locker, there was a site specifically about electricity, and it has all these beautiful graphics about how power plants work and how the electricity is produced, if you're curious. But for purposes of this class, really all you need to know is that most of electricity in the United States, it is currently still produced by burning fossil fuels, right? And that one of the solutions to help mitigate climate change would be to produce more and more of our electricity from renewable sources of fuel that do not emit carbon when you burn them. Because the problem, of course, with burning fossil fuels is that, yes, you get the energy out of them, and that's great, but you're releasing all the carbon dioxide as you get the energy out of these carbon molecules. And I'll remind you that this is not much different chemically than cellular respiration, right? If I burn carbon-containing molecules in coal or oil, it's not that different from burning fatty acids and glucose in my cells. I release energy and I release carbon dioxide, okay? So power plants release a lot of carbon dioxide because they're breaking down a lot of carbon molecules in order to use some of that energy to produce electricity. And of course, by the way, just like in cellular respiration, they're losing most of the energy in heat, which is kind of a waste, right? If you want to be really smart, you build a power plant that captures that heat and uses it to do something useful for us. Okay, that's called cogeneration. What is F1 generation and F2 generation? If you want to see a slide of that, it's in your Intro to Genetics PowerPoint. Also, the textbook has a nice slide. But the idea is that when we're doing genetics crosses, we need some sort of general way to refer to these generations because it gets a little confusing to start saying parents and the offspring of the offspring, right? So the initial parents, if I start out with two organisms and I want to cross them, that's called the parental generation P. When I cross my P generation and I get the first generation of babies, that's called the F1 generation. But a lot of times, if people want to continue to understand what's happening, they cross the F1 generation with each other. And their babies, you can think of them as kind of the grandchildren, right, of the original parents. Those would be the F2 generation, and so on and so forth. You could go F3, F4, etc. Okay? And that is just a language that's used to describe these kinds of crosses when people, really originally Mendel was trying to see, well, what happens if I cross these two parents and then cross the babies? Like, what patterns do I see to try to understand how traits are inherited? Okay, but again, there's nice images of this in both your textbook and in the PowerPoint. I'll remind you, because I can't remember if it's specifically on those sort of fall semester review questions, that there are a number of questions in the genetics section of the final that are basically logic, okay? So you might even want to take a quick glance back at your genetics packet and remind yourself how you can solve logic problems. Okay, and one of the things I mentioned in class, which is really critical, is this idea of using recessive individuals. Okay, because if an organism is homozygous recessive, like little b, right, we already know a ton of information. We know that both of the parents of that organism had to have at least one recessive allele, one little b, right? Because if you had big B, they wouldn't have any little b's to give to the offspring, and there's no way you could create a homozygous recessive offspring. So you know right away when you see an organism that is homozygous recessive that each of its parents had at least one recessive allele. And you know that any offspring that's created from that organism is going to inherit at least one recessive allele because that's all that the organism has to pass on, are two recessive alleles, right? Then you can just use other clues to try to figure out what the other allele is. Okay, and sometimes you have enough information and sometimes you don't, but you know for sure that it will contain at least one recessive allele. Okay, Adam's asking, how are the enzymes in chloroplasts and mitochondria produced and why are they there? Okay, I'm actually going to start with the second question, why are they there? Because there's a lot of chemical reactions happening in chloroplasts and mitochondria, and enzymes make chemical reactions happen, right? They catalyze them, okay, make them happen much faster than they would naturally, okay? So in terms of how they're produced, well, enzymes are proteins, right? So they're produced like all proteins through protein synthesis. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. Chloroplasts and mitochondria are former prokaryotes, right? So as former prokaryotes, they actually have their own little separate DNA, separate from our 46 chromosomes, Okay, next semester I'm going to start using terms like our genome and our mitochondrial genome. Okay, because we actually have our 46 chromosomes and we have genetic information in the DNA of our own mitochondria. Okay, and that's passed on during reproduction as well. And so these organelles, because they used to be little bacteria, have all the function of little bacteria. Their own DNA, their own ribosomes, their own protein synthesis, their own cell division, really, because your mitochondria can split just like a bacteria. That's how you get more mitochondria. Okay? So if you think of them as acting like little bacteria, then you can imagine that they would be able to do their own protein synthesis, produce their own enzymes, and have kind of their own little metabolism going on. Now, because we've had symbiotic relationships with our mitochondria for a very long time, right? It's gotten a little more complicated over evolutionary time. Okay, so now, for example, there are some genes that are in our regular nucleus that make proteins that go into the mitochondria and help out. There's actually some genes in our mitochondria that code for proteins that go out of the mitochondria and do things in our cells. Okay, so they've become a little more interdependent, interfunctioning, interacting. And in fact, there are people who have various kinds of mitochondrial diseases where there's a mutation in the DNA of their mitochondria and they aren't making some protein that they need, or a different protein from their mitochondrial DNA, and sometimes that causes problems, right? So that's just kind of yet another level of complication in genetics, is the fact that we don't really have just one set of DNA, we also have our mitochondrial DNA. Okay, I'll go just a few more minutes. Again, if I'm done and you still like to continue, Mr. Jones is online, I believe, as we speak. I don't know how late he's going to go, probably at least an hour. Okay, so last call. Any questions about your upcoming final? Okay, remember to study in effective ways, actively, using good resources. If I were in your shoes, I'd probably be pulling out all my study guides and putting them in a little packet. Some people like to take those study guides and make a little condensed study guide, use it to make your study card. Figure out what you need to study, let go of what you don't need to study. Ria's asking, when are we getting the quizzes back? I think you mean the meiosis quizzes, right? That will be tomorrow. That's all we got, right? So everybody's already taken it, so that's great. So they're pretty much already scored. I think one period's not. So you'll be getting those back in class tomorrow, and we can go over any questions that you have. And there will be a handful of questions about meiosis on the final, as you might imagine. How did the chloroplast adapt to life inside the eukaryotic cell? That's an interesting question, Larry. It honestly is probably beyond the scope of this class, but it is an event that seems very unusual, doesn't it? So for this free living organism to have to sort of be inside of another cell. We think evolutionarily that it was very unusual, right? That over millions and millions of years that it probably only happened once, because I don't think it would be very easy. Right? Normally the sort of host cell would have just eaten it, let alone adapting to the completely different conditions inside of the cell, right? But, there were millions and millions of years, and for whatever reason it worked this one time. And then, you could see advantages too, right? It's going to provide some sort of protection, right, for the cell that's inside. And so ones that were not fighting against that were able to live in those conditions, probably gained some advantages, right, in terms of protection, and that cell was able to reproduce. Okay, so the interesting thing about evolution is that once it gets started, as long as it works pretty well, it'll keep going, and in fact will probably increase. Okay, so even things that seem not terribly likely, if you give them enough time, might happen. And if that thing, once it happens, works, it will start to spread. Okay, because organisms that have it will reproduce. We'll get into that a lot more when we get to evolution. Okay, but it's kind of an interesting idea. Okay, so I think I'm gonna start to sign off. I wish you all the best of studying. I hate to say luck, it's not really luck, right? But best wishes with your studying. I hope it goes well and that you're able to be efficient and enjoy some time over the weekend too, for sure. And that you can feel calm and confident going into that final and really show what you've learned over the semester. I think you've learned quite a bit. Proud of all of you, and I hope you're proud of everything you've done this semester. And we'll all look forward to the break, right? Okay, so I think I'm going to sign off. Take care. And if you have any other questions, feel free to either go on Mr. Jones' live stream or just write them down, and there'll be some time to get help in class tomorrow. Okay? So, everybody have a great evening. Don't stay up too late, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.